Detective Arthur Blake, a middle-aged man with a keen eye and a sharp mind, arrives in the town of Silent Haven at dusk. The sun sets over a town that seems frozen in time. Streets are deserted, and a strange sense of tranquility hangs in the air. The town, shrouded in a soft mist, seems even quieter than usual. Arthur parks his car and surveys the small town. Old buildings with weathered facades line the streets. The only movement is that of the few residents who watch him with curious and reserved looks, but none of them make a sound. The silence is oppressive, almost palpable. Arthur feels a slight uneasiness, as if he is being watched, but he cannot identify where the sensation comes from. Heading to the only local inn, he is greeted by an elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, who greets him with a suspicious look. She offers him a room with an expression that mixes curiosity and apprehension. The conversation is minimal, with the lady limiting herself to gestures and glances. Arthur decides to begin his investigation by visiting the scene of the disappearance. Young David, who had disappeared without a trace, lived in a small house on the outskirts of the city. Upon arriving there, he finds the house in perfect condition, completely silent, as if time had stopped. As he observes the neighborhood, he notices that, despite a few lights on and people visible through the windows, no one comes out or makes any kind of sound. Arthur begins to wonder if the silence of the city is a local peculiarity or if there is something more sinister behind it. Determined to find out the truth, he decides to go to the police station to get more information, but is met with a disturbing coldness and a silence that he cannot understand. Arthur decides to begin his investigation by visiting the local convenience store, the only store that seems to be a meeting point in town. The establishment is small and modest, with well-stocked shelves, but the atmosphere is muffled by the absence of any sound. The detective enters and is greeted by Mrs. Hawkins, owner of the store, a woman with an austere appearance and eyes that convey a mixture of curiosity and fear. Communication is a challenge. Mrs. Hawkins tries to explain to Arthur, using gestures and an expression that mixes desperation and apathy, that he should go to the mayor for information about David's disappearance. She seems nervous when mentioning the mayor and makes an enigmatic gesture indicating the city hall, which is located in the town's central square. Arthur thanks her and decides to follow the suggestion. Upon arriving at the city hall, he comes across an old building, classical architecture, which seems to be in perfect condition, despite the lack of movement around it. The detective enters and meets Mr. Whitaker, the mayor, an elderly man with a serious expression and an aura of authority. The mayor, like the other inhabitants, does not say a word. His silence is as absolute as that of the town. Arthur tries to question the mayor about David's disappearance and the strange lack of communication, but Whitaker only shakes his head in denial and makes gestures that do not help at all. Feeling of frustration grows within Arthur. He realizes that the town is shrouded in a blanket of silence that goes beyond the simple behavior of the residents. It is as if the silence is an intrinsic part of the town itself. Desperate for answers, Arthur decides to explore the town further. He tries to talk to the residents he meets, but they all remain silent. Every corner, the detective comes across a new layer of the mystery. He cannot shake the feeling that he is being watched by invisible eyes, and the oppressive silence begins to affect his sanity. With each step, the mystery deepens, and the town seems to become a labyrinth of shadows and unrevealed secret. After a frustrating day trying to understand the strange dynamics of the town, Arthur decides to visit the local library, a suggestion made to him by Mrs. Hawkins. The library is an imposing building with large arched windows and a stone facade that dates back to an earlier time. The sign at the entrance is barely visible, covered in dust and cobwebs, reinforcing the feeling that time has stood still in Silent Haven. Inside, the library is a place of absolute silence, with shelves filled with old, dusty books. The detective notices the contrast between the chaos of the outside world and the meticulous order of the library interior. The only sound to be heard is the soft creak of Arthur's footsteps on the wooden floor. Arthur heads to the reception desk, where he finds a librarian, a middle-aged man with an apathetic look on his face. Using gestures, the librarian directs Arthur to explore the historical archives. The detective begins to examine the old books, which are meticulously organized but covered in a thick layer of dust. After several hours of searching, Arthur finds an old, leather-bound volume that catches his eye. The book is titled The History of Silent Haven. As he leafs through it, Arthur discovers a dark tale about the town's founding. The book details an ancient ritual performed by the founders to protect the town from an impending evil. According to the text, a pact was made with a dark entity that required absolute silence to keep its presence at bay. The ritual involved creating a magical barrier that would silence all forms of communication, ensuring that the entity could not interact with the outside world. The book describes how the pact was maintained over the years, with silence being a key part of ensuring the town's safety. Arthur is intrigued and disturbed. The description of the pact matches what he has observed in the town. The silence is not just a local peculiarity, but a protective measure against an entity that could bring great destruction. He realizes that David's disappearance may be related to the attempt to break this pact, or to the discovery of the ritual. As Arthur continues his research, he wonders if the villagers are aware of the true reason behind their silence, or if they have been trapped in a cycle of fear and obedience over the years. The discovery leaves Arthur with more questions than answers, and he decides he needs more information about the ritual and its current condition. Arthur, now armed with new clues, decides to seek more information about the pact and the role of the townspeople in preserving the silence. The most promising clue comes from Agnes, an elderly woman who lives on the outskirts of town and who, according to rumors, has knowledge of ancient local traditions and legends. He finds Agnes in her home, a small cabin surrounded by a wild garden. The lady, despite her advanced age, has a penetrating gaze and a presence that exudes ancient wisdom. When approached by Arthur, she shows a mixture of reluctance and relief at knowing that someone is investigating the town's mystery. Carefully, Agnes begins to communicate with Arthur using a non-verbal method. She writes messages in a notebook while making hand signals. Through this form of communication, Agnes reveals that the pact was made with an entity known as the Silent One, an ancient and evil force that was imprisoned on the condition that the town would maintain absolute silence to ensure that the entity could not escape. Agnes tells Arthur that many years ago, the town was attacked by unknown forces, and that, in a moment of desperation, the town leaders decided to make the pact to protect the population. The silence imposed by the entity is not just a characteristic of the town, but a measure, containment. The pact acts as a prison for the Silent One, who is held captive by the obedience of the residents not to speak. Over time, the townspeople have become accustomed to the rule of silence, and many have come to see the pact as a normal part of their lives, forgetting the horrors that motivated its creation. Agnes reveals that David was researching the pact and that his curiosity may have led to an attempt to break the silence or to a dangerous discovery about the entity. Arthur listens attentively, feeling the gravity of the situation weigh on him. Agnes's information seems to confirm his suspicions that David's disappearance is directly related to the pact. He realizes that if the pact is broken, the entire town could be in grave danger, and the Silent One could be freed. Agnes also mentions that there is an ancient ceremony that can be performed to restore balance, but that it is a risky and complex process. With this new information, Arthur knows he must hurry to avoid impending disaster. He thanks Agnes and decides to follow the clues she left behind to find a way to repair the pact before it is too late. With Agnes's new information, Arthur feels a growing sense of urgency to act. He decides to explore an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town, a place that local rumors suggest may be linked to the ancient rituals and the pact. The mansion is an imposing building, covered in vines and shrouded in an aura of desolation. The windows are broken, and the front door creaks as Arthur enters, revealing a dusty and decaying interior. Inside the mansion, Arthur finds a scene that appears to have been hastily assembled. The place is filled with strange symbols and ancient reliquaries. With a flashlight in hand, the detective explores the rooms, each one darker and more unsettling than the last. In a back room, he discovers a staircase leading to a hidden basement. The basement is an underground cavern with walls covered in esoteric symbols and ancient stains that appear to be dried blood. Arthur finds a series of interconnected chambers, each containing an altar and ritual artifact. In one of these chambers, he finds a table with human remains and sacrificial tools, clear evidence that dark rituals were performed there. In a secret drawer, Arthur discovers an old diary, covered in dust and in poor condition. He opens it carefully and begins to read the entries. The diary belongs to one of the city's founders and details the original ritual performed to imprison the Silent One. The entries tell of how the entity was sealed away through sacrifice and how the city pledged to maintain absolute silence to prevent its release. The diary also mentions a recent event in which someone attempted to perform a ritual to break the pact, which may be linked to David's death. Arthur finds a reference to an incantation that may have been used to try to break the imposed silence. Reading it makes it clear that the attempt to break the pact may have triggered a series of catastrophic events. A sense of urgency grows in Arthur. If the pact has indeed been compromised, the entity may be about to manifest itself. He must find a way to restore the pact before the Silent One breaks free and brings destruction to Silent Haven. The discovery of the artifacts and the diary not only confirms his suspicions, it also highlights the gravity of the situation. Arthur decides to return to the library to research more about the enchantment mentioned in the diary and find a way to reverse the damage done. The night is dark and silent, and the detective feels a growing weight on his shoulders, knowing that every moment counts. Arthur returns to the library with renewed determination to learn more about the enchantment that can restore the pact. The library, though silent as ever, seems almost alive with the energy of this recent discovery. The detective heads to the section of rare manuscripts and ancient texts, where he begins researching the enchantments described in the journal found in the mansion. He spends hours poring over ancient tomes and arcane texts. Eventually, he finds a manuscript that describes a reintegration ritual designed to restore the pact and keep the Silent One imprisoned. The ritual requires a series of specific components and a sacred place where the pact can be renewed. The manuscript details the need for a central altar, 3 magical artifacts, and the recitation of a specific incantation to reseal the entity. As Arthur reads, he realizes that the ritual must be performed in the center of the city, where the magical energy is strongest. The text also mentions that any failure during the ritual could have disastrous consequences, releasing the Silent One from his captivity and causing unimaginable chaos. Arthur prepares to meet with Mayor Whitaker to discuss the details and gain the cooperation needed to perform the ritual. He is greeted at City Hall with a look of relief mixed with fear. The mayor reveals that despite the silence, there is a secret community in the city that knows the details of the pact and the rituals required to uphold it. Whitaker gestures with difficulty to the location of the central altar, which is hidden in an old chapel outside of town. He confirms that David was approaching this area when he disappeared, suggesting that he may have discovered the same ritual and was attempting the process himself. With their plan in mind, Arthur and the mayor head to the old chapel. The chapel is an aged stone structure, covered in moss and shrouded in an aura of desolation. Inside, they find the central altar, covered in a layer of dust and cobwebs. The location is marked with ancient symbols that match those found in the journal. As Arthur prepares the components of the ritual, he senses a growing presence of tension in the air. The silence in the chapel is oppressive, almost as if it is waiting for something. The detective uses the magical artifacts and begins to recite the incantation described in the manuscript. As he progresses through the ritual, the air around him seems to vibrate, and a feeling of cold permeates the space. Suddenly, a loud crash echoes through the chapel, and a shadow manifests itself in the corner of the altar. The Silent One begins to materialize, a dark and menacing figure that exudes an aura of terror. Arthur feels his heart race, but he continues the incantation with determination. Time seems to drag as the incantation reaches its climax, and the detective wonders if he will be able to complete the ritual before it is too late. The atmosphere in the chapel grows increasingly intense as the Silent One manifests. The entity, a nebulous and menacing presence, begins to fill the space with a palpable energy of despair and malice. Altar Arthur is working on begins to glow with a faint light, but the entity seems to resist the attempted sealing. The atmosphere becomes charged with tension and fear, with the silence now interrupted by a low, unsettling murmur. Arthur, sweating and with his heart racing, concentrates on maintaining focus on the incantation. Each word of the ritual must be pronounced with precision, or the pact may be permanently broken. Mayor Whitaker, visibly nervous, watches closely, holding the magical artifacts Arthur has indicated. The presence of the Silent One causes the chapel to pulsate, and the sound of the entity is like an ominous whisper that seems to echo in Arthur's mind. As the incantation progresses, the entity tries to intervene, creating disturbances in the space around it. The shadows writhe, and the walls of the chapel begin to shake. Arthur struggles to remain calm, knowing that any mistake could lead to the total release of the Silent One. The ritual requires him to maintain his concentration and steady voice, despite the growing fear that tries to invade him. Suddenly, a high-pitched scream shatters the silence of the chapel. David, the missing young man, appears, pale and disoriented. He is visibly shaken, and his look seems to reflect a mixture of relief and terror. David's appearance suggests that he may have fallen victim to the effects of the pact, or that he is linked to the entity in some way. Arthur realizes that David may be controlled by the Silent One, or may be a key to completing the ritual. Arthur, now more determined than ever, intensifies the incantation, knowing that he must complete the ritual to save David and ensure the safety of the city. He makes a final effort, uttering the final words of the incantation as the entity struggles to break through the magical barrier. The ground beneath their feet vibrates, and the sound of an almost deafening roar fills the chapel. Finally, an intense glow emanates from the altar, and a wave of energy sweeps through the chapel. The entity seems to be pulled back into the dimension from which it came, and the feeling of oppression begins to fade. The ritual is completed successfully, and the entity is sealed away again. Silence returns, but this time it is a silence of relief, not terror. Arthur, exhausted and with his heart pounding, approaches David. The young man is in a state of shock, but seems to be free of the entity's control. Whitaker approaches, also relieved, and thanks Arthur for his courage and determination. Chapel, now quiet, offers a brief moment of peace before reality returns to the city. The chapel, now in absolute silence, offers a brief moment of tranquility after the confrontation with the Silent One. Arthur, still panting, watches David, who is visibly shaken but free from the influence of the entity. The young man tries to compose himself, looking at the detective with a mixture of gratitude and fear. Whitaker, relieved, thanks Arthur, acknowledging that the city has been saved from imminent destruction. The ritual was successful, but the price was high. The city of Silent Haven, although still silent, is marked by the scars of the recent confrontation. The sudden calm is accompanied by a sense of loss and that something important was sacrificed to ensure safety. Arthur, with a sense of duty fulfilled, knows that his journey was not in vain. The emotional impact is profound. Arthur decides to accompany David back to the city. As they walk through the silent streets, the detective reflects on what happened. The silence, which once seemed like a cloak of protection, now reveals itself as a prison, a dark contract made to contain an ancient evil. He realizes that the town, despite having been saved, will never be the same again. Pact, although restored, leaves an indelible mark on the hearts of the townspeople and on his own soul. When they arrive at City Hall, Arthur and David are greeted by a crowd of residents who, although silent, show an expression of relief and gratitude. Mayor Whitaker addresses the group and makes a symbolic gesture, indicating that the town must now move forward, rebuilding what was lost and remembering the horrors they faced. Arthur bids farewell to David and the townspeople. He is aware that the experience in Silent Haven will change his life forever. The detective leaves the town with a feeling of reflection and regret, knowing that while the pact has been restored, the emotional scars and trauma will remain. He leaves, knowing that the stories of Silent Haven will stay with him forever. Reminder of the secrets that silence can hide, and the costs of protecting such a terrible secret. As he drives out of town, Arthur glances in his rearview mirror and sees Silent Haven slowly disappearing into the distance. The silence that once enveloped him is now a reminder of a battle fought and won. With the town at his feet and the mystery solved, Arthur prepares to face new challenges, taking with him the lessons and shadows of Silent Haven.